in maybe 15, 20 minutes and hopefully have a conversation with you, because honestly, there's not really a whole lot that I can say about this. There are people who are much more qualified here who could probably add to it. So I'll try to keep it to that. Just a few sort of a preface in some ways. What I intend doing is essentially talking about how people like me are absolutely unqualified to do many of the things we end up doing. And I'll try to motivate that in a little bit. Yesterday, I met a young baby, 7 months old. A friend of ours had adopted her. And they were remarking how when they got her around a month or 2 months ago, she didn't cry. And maybe at first you're a parent, you're an apprehensive parent, and you feel lucky you have a baby who doesn't cry. But then all of us who've, we've all been babies, right? That's one thing we all can claim to have been. We know, in a sense, we cry because in some ways there's the environment that responds to it. And that crying is a natural instinct, it's a natural activity of a baby. And obviously this baby has been deprived of something, not just something, almost everything, that this baby wasn't crying. The baby had given up on crying. And in the same spirit, I would like to just say that I think learning is something that is so natural amongst children. And if we have a system in which whatever benchmarks we want to use, 50% of these children we say that they are failing, there must be terribly something wrong with this system. And somebody somewhere has to have the guts to take a big hammer and just crush this system. Because this system is not working. And perhaps if we left these kids alone, they may actually end up be doing a whole lot better than whatever folk like us are doing. I'm already at 15 minutes. Okay, all right, anyway. So the point here is, I think, there is a need in some ways for us to critically examine the system. And I can turn my attention to many folk out there, but I'd rather turn it on people like me, because that's the only right thing to be doing. And locate in some ways our place in doing a lot of things wrong, and perhaps what we can learn so that we can make it a little bit better. Now, I'm not going to get into a theoretical sort of explanation of what a system is, but essentially we all know a system consists of many actors, and what really matters is the relationships between them, right? And I want to emphasize the fact that if you are interested in understanding systems, and if you're interested in understanding how we bring about change, then surely the focus has to be on relationships. But unfortunately, most of our methods and the methods that people like me use are grossly incapable of understanding relationships. We look at things more as sort of, as snapshots. We may do a longitudinal study, but people like me, and when I'm saying people like me, essentially those who use quantitative methods, we use snapshots. We go in, we come out. After some time, we go back in again, and we come out. The relationships, at best, that we might be aware of are those that are written down in paper, that have been spelled out formally. And if there's one thing we know in India, if it's on paper, then it's probably not there on practice. And yet, despite that truth that we all seem to repeat so often, we have the right policies, we just don't know how to implement them. Implementation is the place for failure. We spend so little time as researchers understanding the implementation process, which has both formal and informal components to it. The system is written, but more importantly, the system is practiced. And if we, as researchers, and this is where my sort of motivation or plea in some ways for action research comes in, if we as researchers are not embedded in some form, and I'll talk about the dangers of embeddedness also, but if we are not involved in action of some form, then we are merely scratching the surface of the system that we are in turn then going to prescribe and then preach about how we need to change, right? So that's really the thesis, or that's really the argument that I want to put forth. What's the inspiration? I am a professor, I need to pretend to be one. Conceptually, what am I doing here? I'm moving conceptually away from this idea that policy is something that is a problem-solving tool. Sure, we would like it to be. Everybody who practices policy, everybody who commits resources to policy wants it to be, and it should be. But policy, we all know, is much more than that. At the end of the day, policy is a lot of performance. Policy is a lot of sort of rhetoric, right? Policy is in responding to multiple political interests that are out there. We have to understand how policy is being practiced and what policy in fact is. Why is it there? Who is it helping? If it's not helping the children, but it surely must be helping someone because it continues to be there, right? And there is so much resistance to its change. So who is it helping? And we can't find answers to these questions, I'm sorry, but at a level, of saying, hey, let's answer this question at the national level. No, that's not where policy is acting. Policy is acting in your school. Policy is acting with the school teacher, the principal. Those are, in some ways, when it comes to education, and this is always sort of, where I begin most of my policy classes at, that's really where Indian policy is being made. As far as the school, as far as the child is concerned, the teacher is the policy maker. And if we don't accept that and we don't recognize that, then we're just simply barking up a wrong tree when we say we are doing policy research. Now, what could be action research? Before I get to that, here is who I am going to own up to be, right? I have no education training. I've never been trained in education. But in my bio, and that's from my younger days, as somebody said who just met me, that I met you when you were much younger. It's people like me again, and I'm being harshly critical, and I've got the license to be provocative in some ways. So take it with that spirit. We've not been trained in education, but when we talk about education, we talk about it dogmatically. This is what you need to do. Reduce your student-teacher ratios. Let's privatize all schools. I don't know. I mean, the next big silver bullet, right? That's seemingly what we want to run. We want to fire, and based on what? Maybe a randomized control trial. These experiments, and thank you for, in my bio also including that, I've worked with a company which does experiments. It started experiments in the US, right? These experiments are not designed to answer the why questions. Why does something work? They can tell you what has something worked at all, right? These experiments that we spend so much on today, they're really writing history. And I don't have any objection to history. There's a lot to be learned from history. But let's see it as that. They are writing history. And what I'm not even talking about, one can ask how contextually relevant a lot of these experiments are. We want evidence. But most of this evidence that we are making or we are talking about today has come from 5 years ago, perhaps, or even more. Most of it has come in probably from one state where the state government was amiable to these experiments. And it's on the basis of that we want to propagate policy. And even working within this paradigm, and I'm now raising a technical issue, and that's sort of, if you're reading some mumbo jumbo out there, it's because of those people like me who believe in this mumbo jumbo, that look, a central requirement when we are doing causal inference and we are working with experiments is that your treatment needs to be well defined, and we just said policy in India is written in a way and it's practiced in completely different ways. So even technically, we are barking up a very wrong tree when we are advocating hugely expensive experiments to answer all questions that perhaps are of interest to us. I practice experiments. In fact, I'm still teaching a PhD course on experiments. So please don't get me wrong. I see a value for them. But let's understand what that value is. And this is where I'm sort of in some ways making the plea that, and I've heard this from somebody from UNICEF who said, look, I am not going to support any more research unless it's action research. And I think there's good reason for that. Because we really do need people to be driven by some experience. Researchers need to have some experience about what they're talking about. And one way to do that as a researcher is to act in some form. especially in a country where we are so resource staffed, the idea that we can simply be dispassionate observers, and nobody is a dispassionate observer. Nobody is a neutral observer. Right? But that idea in a resource staffed country like ours is even more damaging. Right? Now, does this mean this idea of the engaged researcher, which I've borrowed from some folk who've done excellent research in the UK, does that apply to us? That an engaged researcher works alongside policymakers and practitioners in the field, using our research-based knowledge to inform decision-making as it occurs. In an ideal world, and if we were in that ideal world, I would agree. This is exactly what I dream of. But in our context, what does it mean to work alongside? What does it mean to work alongside a partner, the state, the government, where the power disproportionately resides there? When simply a transfer of an individual can change what the so-called policy is going to be. If they don't like what you are saying, and I've had multiple experiences of that, right? When they don't like what you're saying, they can use the choicest words to describe how useless you are, right? And whose decision-making do we need to inform? Whose decision-making can we inform? Do we need to always be talking to the decision maker in Gandhinagar, in Delhi? Because that's what it seems like, when people like me, the net-heads, right? When we are doing our research, we seem to be always trying to speak to the person on the top. And if this person could just listen to us, then we would solve the problem. Hey, but the person on the top might listen to you, but the person on the ground, the teacher, she is working in a completely different context and probably doing the best that she can, right? Do we want to create knowledge for that person? Do we think that we are too important to be creating knowledge for that person, despite the fact that this is the person who makes the most critical, impactful influence on a child's life, right? So whose decision that are we talking about? Now, just to give you some examples, and I'll run through some examples quickly, and then I'll take some question and answers, and I'll open the conversation for comments, not just question and answers. This is the map that we typically saw during COVID. What are the infection rates? Now, I often see this map and I ask myself, who exactly would this be useful for? These are the ones that we saw in most newspapers, front pages, etc. And maybe I think an alien who's coming out from, from a different planet, deciding where to land, which country to go to, given that there's a pandemic, maybe they could be useful for that person. Right? Obviously, I'm being a little bit facetious here. It's useful in terms of comparative policy analysis and all that. But what I'm saying is this is where we disproportionately spend our time. This is where this is definitely not a pat on my back, but this is a group of researchers who were working with me during COVID. This is what they did. This is the kind of map they created. As soon as the lockdown happened, one of them who lived in one of these communities went around trying to map out where the migrant workers who were stuck there, because they no longer had the informal lorries, the shops, etc. running. Where were these people stuck? Because they didn't even have any access to food. So he went around and he kept reporting to the other groups and plotting out where exactly these people were stuck and how many were stuck, and then what we could do. So community kitchens, etc. got started. This is a very different map than this. And again, nothing wrong with this, but I just want to emphasize the need to look at things at a more granular level, because that's where real action happens. During COVID, one of the things that we did was we had done a survey earlier, and we said, these are the parents who probably need assistance at this time. We started calling up parents, getting them food, etc., etc. One of the things that we found out was that 85% of parents of children who were in government schools got nothing in lieu of midday meals. Now, under the Right to Food Act, you're mandated to get that, right? A newspaper took this finding up, and the High Court took suo motu cognizance of it. And suddenly one day when I wake up, and I had no idea all of this was happening, in terms of the High Court taking suo motu cognizance of it, I get a series of WhatsApp messages, one after another. right? Basically abusing me in some ways for this survey, right? So this is where, in some part, where I want to caution us, even in this idea of an engaged embedded researcher, where should we be going? And I have sort of a suggestions of an answer. I'll just come back to that. This is right to education, the 12(1)(c), the part that was being spoken about earlier. This is where, in some ways, I first maybe learned about the idea of action research and what we started doing. In Ahmedabad, Indus Actions, there was a presentation. They've done some beautiful work there. They were, in some ways, our inspiration as well. We've done a whole lot of interventions in Ahmedabad to get this right implemented. And when we started, there was nothing really happening there. Right? We started up this. It's a student-run center. It doesn't really exist officially in some ways. And I just want to end here, because what you see, and the thing that I want to emphasize, is that we went from English media coverage to essentially larger Gujarati coverage. Because what happened during this time period was, as we acted, we really went, in some ways, in terms of layers of communities, we went deeper and deeper. And finally, the people who actually took this up in a very significant way were the ward councillors. Now, who would have imagined ward councillors would have helped you implement the right to education? But their ability, if we could convince just 2 of them, and one was genuinely motivated, and their ability to mobilize resources and take to the community is remarkable. Right? I'm not saying, again, no universal truths here. Doesn't make every single ward councillor somebody that we would, want to have a cup of tea with. But yet, it was them who actually led to this. And today, despite the fact that we don't do really any work in terms of popularizing RT, etc., the numbers in Gujarat still, on at least in this parameter, appear to be much better than they are in many of the other states. And I think that's really by virtue of the fact that this is now gotten its basis, it's found its roots. And it's going to be very difficult in some sense to take it away. Now, so what do I have in mind when I say action research? What do I have in mind when I say embedded? I think rather than trying to work with the state in some sense and asking the state to give us access, I think we need to begin this with the communities, because they are the ones who, at the end of the day, are most directly impacted by what we do or what we don't do. And we've got to find our way as researchers into these communities, not as data collectors, because, if you work in cities and if you've actually done any direct data collection, the sense of fatigue that people have, they ask you, what have you come here for now? Right? What are you going to do with this data? And honestly, I'm still involved in surveys, etc., and I can talk to you more about them. I, at times, really do struggle with this question: what am I going to do with this data that is going to be of value, of use to them? And I think it's shameful, really, that despite my years of working, and maybe it's just a shortcoming in me, that I don't have a better answer than saying, we will suggest better policies, we will suggest things that can be done better, etc., and we give them maybe, I don't want to say false hopes, but sometimes they do sound like that, right? And so I think we need to really find a way to work with that community, and I think we actually have in our architecture these rights, and this is where I feel very I don't know, depressed is too strong a word, but disappointed that the right to education, we've seemingly lost that in the discourse around education. I know it's the time for NEP, it's a time for FLN, it's a time for all of that, and all of those are extremely important things. But hey, the right to education is that basic architecture that we have, which gives people the right to start with a very basic level of education. We can have complaints about it. We can point to the limitations of it. But that is, at the end of the day, the only thing which the person who is otherwise deprived of any other resources, all other kinds of empowerment has. And we seemingly have lost that in our discourse. And why is that? I don't have a clear answer. But I think working off this framework, as I said, working with communities, trying to in some ways get access to a policy arena through the communities, using the rights, and this is where right to food helped us, right to education, as I saw, again provided an architecture for us, and this is where I think we can build. I know I sound a little bit cynical, I sound, whatever, old, but I think we have within our policy, within very much what the state has enacted, means to become much better engaged researchers. So I'll just end there, and if we have time for a few questions or comments, I'll take that. Thank you. So it's absolutely something that we struggle with, and I have more or less come down to saying that I will not go out and collect data until I can see it in some form connected to practice, indirectly connected to practice, not this abstract goal of changing policy in the longer run. So even when we were doing this, for instance, during COVID, we were collecting data, but we were ensuring if the parents needed even say help with paying their tuitions, we provided that money. So I think for me the only way to deal with this disconnect is a more direct relationship between knowledge and practice.
To the last comment of yours about RT, that enthusiasm for RT is flagged. I certainly see it, and I think it's partly because NGOs have much more now do not see their role as being critical of government or pointing out shortcomings, but they now see their role entirely as partners. And when you are a partner, not a critical partner, but you're a partner, and you certainly are a junior partner in all of that. So, and because funding, etc., comes from this kind of partnership, all kinds of things are swept under the carpet. And one area is the whole idea of, and I agree with you, that RTE is at least the basic thing that we can give a child from any community, poor especially, all right, is something which looks like a school. Mm-hmm. And we call it a school, a trained teacher. That's all that is being provided in the Act, right. All right? But now it's being diluted, no end. The failure has come into it, all right? And I don't see any protest by NGOs on this. Maybe the RT forum in Delhi, all right? Thank God for that, okay? But otherwise, NGOs have completely lost their interest in RT.
But, no, I agree with that, but I think there's also been, in some ways, a failure to deepen this right among the communities themselves. If the rights are being deprived, in some sense, we should be expecting communities to speak up. I mean, given that we've had this right for, at least 15 years or 14 years. And I think that's where also a lot of, I think, I'm a little bit apprehensive about, and I know you are not talking about it, but a little bit apprehensive about the polarity which says protest or in some ways get co-opted. I think we have to find this middle path. And you're not saying this at all. I'm just building.
I work with government.
So, and I think, there are, I mean, for instance, in this action, right? I think I'm sure it's not an easy task, but a lot of the organizations that were behind that RTE, in some ways, just said, okay, our job's done, once the RTE came to be. And I think that's where maybe we dropped the ball as well. Yes.
Thanks for that. That was wonderful. My question was more around the objective of research, right? From a perspective that research can guide policy itself, and then some of the examples that you pointed out was around how research can guide accountability on those policies. In my experience working in government, I've noticed that evidence-backed approaches, for example, structured pedagogy is something that has the highest effect sizes amongst the idea of educational interventions, and that's something that has helped us sell the idea of structured pedagogy or believe it in ourselves, right? So when we model the state like Madhya Pradesh, Tripura. So while that research has a distinctive use case, my question is more around action research, which is more focused around driving accountability. And especially the word, you said work alongside, right? Like these stakeholders are really not that keen to work alongside researchers that bring out these gaps. In that case, how do you embed yourself in systems how do you embed yourself in these systems to actually guide that sort of thinking, right? Because now everything would have been externally done where you actually said, oh, hey, look, and then you got these barrage of messages, right? So how do you actually embed yourself, or how do you drive this research-oriented approach towards policy accountability and implementation within systems, which is currently absent?
By paying a whole lot more attention to the community. We think often, and I'm not denying it, it's the guy sitting in the office who has to make the decision. And if he can only provide the right evidence to that person will be convinced, and then they will pull the lever. Right? And the person on the top also does need to do several things. But if we have this risk of being co-opted, or we are not being listened to, or they have no interest in what we are doing, or they're not interested in education, period. And we have all of these category of people there, right? Who are the people who are interested in education? The parents. How much of our time as researchers do we spend with parents? Do we take our studies, research results back to the parents and get them motivated behind, for instance, the idea of structured pedagogy? Why do we assume that okay, fine, they may not understand it very quickly, but hey, when you count the millions that we spend educating the so-called policymakers, maybe a few thousands here would also help. Today, again, sorry, just going back to something that I'm also bothered by. Civil society is in stress, and there's a lot that civil society today cannot do. But I also feel there is a lot that civil society still can do, and which is, if it would turn its directions instead of up, if it would look down or look to the side, I think there's a lot we can do also. So that's what I'm trying to, so you will find in some ways your dream bureaucrat on the other side, who understands everything and was maybe waiting for that evidence to come to their table, and then they were going to act. But most of the time, folk are not acting despite the evidence.
So one aspect that I found quite useful in looking at teachers, perhaps an extension of communities as well, they're not kind of living to...
Sorry.
They're not exactly, there to fulfill our dreams. They're there to fulfill their own dreams. How can we get them to articulate those dreams in such a way that they become goals to be worked towards, and then the research is sort of guided or influenced by the questions that are embedded in those particular dreams. So I think, that initial sharing of having a common goal to work towards, wherein we don't have to go in with any thrust from our side, and but just by asking, by inquiring, by listening, to help them formulate in such a way that then it makes sense for both parties to work together. Because if the objective is essentially to support the teacher to make things better in the classroom for children, then it doesn't matter if it is X or Y or Z, as long as it is within this broad range. Rather than going in with something very fixed, that I want this particular aspect of material or pedagogy or whatever, then I find that it's much easier to have both entry and more sustained interaction, irrespective of programs that come and go from the top. So this kind of, I don't know what, collegial engagement or whatever you want to call it, is perhaps, what you were calling working alongside, is a way to go. But that's the initial part. is about that sharing, the dream of the teacher rather than your own. That is perhaps something that might work better.
And the whole idea of action research, I mean, I'm sure you know, its origins are in education.
Yeah, sure.
Its origins are in the classroom. I mean, it's now that, again, folk like me are coming and trying to appropriate it, but it's
Well,
there.
interestingly, for a long time, like about 10 years, there was a proper action research program implemented by the government of India through the NCERT, and every year some 8 to 10,000 teachers were part of it. You'll find those archives in the NCERT, and a large number of things like this were actually researched. Unfortunately, it died out around 2003.
Civil society phase. Why is there the thing of action research creating the evidence that goes on top? Because that's where, if it changes there, it'll trickle down to changes, And what is the constraints that civil society organizations face in this? See, what has happened in the recent past is that, I think this is one of the main reasons of this whole thing of you do the action research, you interact with the system, you try to change, bring about change, but you get evidence on that and you send it up. That is because there's much more driven towards scale. And civil society organizations in themselves are happy to engage with communities and so on. But even funding now is going only if you can do scale. So there is this push, which is in a direction that is not always, it's a dysfunctional direction.
No, absolutely. And I think, that's where, in a sense, I can talk about, one can talk about what happens within the government, but they are not the actors sitting here. But so maybe the systems change that we are talking about really needs to begin with us, right? Because that's where a lot of things need changing as well. So I think I'm out of time, but thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Sarin, for that brutally honest take on the connection between research and practice. I request Dr. Gulam Karga to please felicitate Dr. Sarin.